the sociability of sleep, and we are recording. My name is Devon Bate. I am a composer and sound designer. I'm currently researching sleep media at Concordia University, and I'm a research assistant with the Sociability of Sleep project. I'm delighted to be here with you today for the third Sleep Salon, or fourth Sleep Salon of 2022. Fourth, I've lost the plot. Fourth Sleep Salon. Fifth. Anyway, a Sleep Salon. The session will be recorded, so please feel free to leave your camera off. And when we post it on the website, I'll make sure it has captions. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Sociability of Sleep project is physically located in Jojaga, otherwise known as Montreal, and is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Ganingahaga. We recognize with gratitude that they are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet, live, and rest. Jojaga has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Ganingahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg peoples. I would also like to share an acknowledgement developed by the Feminist Media Studio at Concordia for our pandemic forms of assembly. So while Zoom, a company that has exploded in value during the pandemic, is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located. Zoom's headquarters are located on Muwegma Ohlone territory. The Ohlone have historically understood sustainability, about communal societies, about giving gifts to those who pass by, and about sharing space. Their horizontal organization might inspire different emergent models of peer-to-peer networking in the pandemic and than we're enacting here in Zoom. So we see Zoom as a platform which connects us and which alienates us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation. I'd also like to acknowledge that the Sociability of Sleep is supported by funding from the Government of Canada's New Frontiers in Research Fund. On the Sociability of Sleep website, you can sign up for the newsletter to find out more about upcoming events such as future sleep salons and the upcoming call for artist residencies. Please reach out if you're interested in learning more or collaborating. So for today, thank you for taking time to be here. During the salon, please feel free to use the chat to share thoughts, comments, and relevant links that our discussion today brings up for you. We're going to have a Q&A after our speakers, and today we'll be taking a speakers list in the chat, and we'll invite you to open up your mic and ask your own questions, though you can also post them in the chat if you prefer that I read them. Today's conversation will take place in English. However, please feel free to ask any questions or make comments in French, and we are happy to translate. And with that, I turn to the speakers. I'm going to introduce them before they speak, and they'll speak for 20 to 25 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and discussions. All right, so beginning with Mendi and Keith Obadike. Mendi and Keith Obadike make music, art, and literature with a catalog of works ranging from internet operas to poetry books to large-scale sound installations. Their recent 8-hour piece, Lull, A Sleep Temple, which was performed as a live stream event during the pandemic, is meant to accompany sleep. And with that, I turn it over to Mendi and Keith.
Hi. Devon, thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for having us. We're happy to be here.
Very much so. So we're going to talk a little bit about Lull, a Sleep Temple, which is a project that consciously engages sleep. But we're also going to talk first about some of the works that we made before Lull that kind of led to that place.
So we'll start a few years back, and we'll play about, roughly about 2 minutes of each of these pieces just to give you a little context for our work. And so what we'll say about these earlier pieces is that we were not thinking about sleep when we made these pieces, but we were thinking about the idea of meditation. And so working through this idea of meditation across projects really got us eventually to thinking about sleep overtly. So we'll start with a piece called The Earth. And The Earth was a musical piece that we made for two poets, and the filmmaker Audre Lorde and Marlon Riggs. And so we'll play you a little bit of that. Let's see here.
What they call hair is already dead. Can we be like this? What they call living, our necessary lives beneath what they call the surface. Then dying. Then moving on. Can we be useful? Or what they call beautiful? Even after what they call our death? What do you know? If not the venom that others reserve for people like you. How else can you fight it? If not by recording, it's dry slither on your own unfaithful tongue, not knowing what to do with my hand.
So that was a piece that we made in around 2008. And I think one thing we neglected to sort of clarify here at the top is, the difference between the idea of sleep and meditation, because people might have different ideas about that. And so for us, we would say the idea of meditation is sort of redirecting focus. And so we've always thought about sort of deep listening practices as a form of meditation. And so that's how we got to thinking about working on meditation in the musical pieces as well as installations.
Yeah, I'll just add that because our projects are often, we're often doing research on an idea or sometimes a historical moment. We realize that the form of engagement that people are invited to have with the work, with our project, is actually one of meditation rather than of another kind of use of a historical document, for example. And so thinking about both these deep listening practices as a way that we wanted for people to deal with any kind of listening or idea, we started to think more about meditation and more about different states of being. as we made projects.
Yeah. So, we're going to jump ahead in time. These things aren't exactly in chronological order, but we want to give you a sense of our thinking before we got into lull. So around 2012, we did a piece called American Cipher. And this piece, as the name suggests, we were looking at American history, and we were really looking at this relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, a woman who was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, and we're looking at their relationship through this object, a bell that belonged to Sally Hemings. And so we use that piece to make a sound installation. And with that installation, we wanted to make a sort of meditative space for thinking about history and culture. And so we'll show you a little bit of this installation. This was at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And we'll just play about 1.5 minutes of this piece.
So anything else you want to say about that piece, or should we go to the next?
I guess we could say that was a sort of 8-channel sound piece, single channel video. So we've shown it in different kind of spaces, but usually in a museum or gallery context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So then the next piece we're going to show you is it's called Sonic Migrations Homes. It's a piece. We had 2 pieces when we did Sonic Migration. One is, should we show Morning Comes First?
Yeah.
Okay, so they're both about Charles Albert Tindley, who is a composer. He wrote a lot of songs that we have that are commonly known in the Black church. He was also an activist.
And a preacher.
And a preacher. And so we were partnered with this institution that was called Tindley Temple. It wasn't called Tindley Temple when Tindley was there, but it was named after him afterwards. And we wanted to think about what it meant to investigate the kind of spatial concerns in his work. So spatial and temporal. So the first thing we're going to show you is Sonic Migration Morning Comes, where we play an extended lyric from his song By and By When the Morning Comes at daybreak.
And so this piece we've stretched out, so it's not exactly recognizable as the Charles Albert Tindley song. And so we've kind of almost stretched his piece out into a long drone that rises with the sun each morning. Mm-hmm. So this is Morning Comes. And so we should say for context that the other part of that project was a piece dealing with the inside of that church, of the sanctuary. And so we mic the inside of the place with contact mics and accelerometers to record sounds from the structure itself. And we use those to reinterpret another song by Charles Albert Tindley. So both of these things we sort of stretched out and manipulated and reworked the text. So we're thinking about the church as a place of meditation, but also as a site of activism. And so across these projects, you know, we're thinking about both meditation and action, these things as companions. So next, just in the interest of time, I think we're gonna go to Lull, a sleep temple, just to give you a little bit of that piece. Pull it up here. So we'll play. I think we have time to play about 5 minutes of it, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ideas. Okay, yeah.
So it's an 8-hour piece, just so you have a sense of where it is in the context.
All right, so we'll play you the first few minutes of the piece. Okay.
A light rain falls on the roof of the shed made of tin. The sun sets, and the day gives way to night. Who can remember what we said, what we wore, what we ate? The moon says, paradise. The star says 7.
Okay, so that was a little bit of Lull, a Sleep Temple. So you want to talk a little bit about how we thought about that?
Yeah, so while we've been thinking about meditation as the approach to listening that we were inviting and other pieces, when we made Lull, we've been thinking about the fact that a lot of people weren't sleeping. This was in 2020 during the pandemic. A lot of people were wrestling with sleep or inability to sleep. We had been thinking for a couple of years about doing a sleep piece, but we began thinking a lot more about sleep as a restorative process and a process that allows you both meditation and sleep are processes that can give one something in order to act next, right? But for sleep, we were thinking a lot about restoration and so we had, because we've been thinking about sleep pieces for a while, we were looking at precedents for the work in things like the Egyptian sleep temples, where people would go and for healing practices that required sleep. We also were thinking a lot about the idea of dreams as really important part of one's life.
Yeah, the idea there, I think, is we're really thinking about the dreams as a political tool. Is we thought about how many people, certainly in the African American tradition, refer to dreams as people are sort of mapping out paths to freedom. So obviously many people refer to Martin Luther King talking about his dream, but Maya Angelou talked about dreams. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. A lot of people have talked about dreams because often that's about the imagining of something that is not quite here yet. And obviously, in order to dream, you need to sleep. And so that looking through those ideas across the literature really helped us think about the sort of political aspect of sleep. Yeah. And I guess the only other thing we'll tell you about how we made it, I mean, although we thought about this project for a long time, we made it in a relatively short amount of time, in a few weeks. For a long time, we thought about doing our sleep piece as a sort of live event. And then the pandemic hit, and it seemed like actually the perfect time to do it online, right? In order to kind of share the idea with the largest amount of people. And so, we made a lot of, sort of really slow moving pieces. We pulled text from books about dreams and
myths about dreams, and a lot of myths from across time, actually. And so we tried to approach the writing of those with the same way that we dealt with the musical ideas by slowing down and having a lot of repetition, reworking, reordering. We've been thinking a lot about rhythm and the ways that rhythms can induce sleep.
And some of that came from the earlier pieces where we were looking at meditation, right? So we spent a lot of time looking at sort of hypnotic scripts and induction text, things that produce results that allow one to change states. So generally we had an interest in altered states, and so the sleep piece came out of this kind of long sonic investigation into altered states. But I guess, I think we'll stop there and we'll pass the baton to Gascia.
All right, thank you so much, Mindy. Thank you so much, Keith. That's amazing. Leading up to this salon, it's been such a joy to become engaged with your work, and I have no shortage of questions for the Q&A, and I promise not to monopolize on it. So now let us move on to Gascia. Gascia Ouzounian is Associate Professor of Music at the University of Oxford. Her work explores concepts and technologies of spatial sound, most recently in the book Stereophonica, Sound and Space in Science, Technology, and the Arts. Since 2013, Ouzounian has co-directed the research group Recomposing the City, which brings together sound artists, architects, and urban designers in developing interdisciplinary approaches to urban sound studies and urban sonic practice. Recent projects include Scoring the City in 2020, which explores experimental notations for urban design, and Acoustic Cities, London and Beirut from 2019, for which 10 artists were invited to create works that responded to the acoustic conditions of London and Beirut. Ouzounian is the recipient of a consolidator grant from the European Research Council for the project Sonora Cities, a 5-year project she currently directs at Oxford. It is formed at the intersection of critical urbanism, experimental sound practice, and critical spatial practices. Ouzounian holds degrees in music technology and violin performance from McGill University, and critical studies and experimental practices in music from the University of California, San Diego. With that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Devon. Thank you so much, Alana, for the invitation, and to everyone on the Sociability of Sleep team. It's been such a pleasure to be in touch with you. And I'm also grateful for everyone because we had to reschedule the session because I was really unwell for the original. So thank you for enabling that and for coming today. I'm going to just share my screen and yeah, I also wanted to say it's such an honor to share a platform with Mendi and Keith Obadike, who are artists whose work I've admired for a really, really long time. And it's just such beautiful work. Okay, so I'm looking at my share screen and for some reason PowerPoint isn't coming up. So let me just try to save and quit PowerPoint in case that's the issue. I apologize for that. And then I'll try that one more time. Of course, when we were doing the tech run through, it worked perfectly fine. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we'll try that. And I'm going to just start from the top. So, and I'm going to just see if I can see some of you. Can people hear okay? Is that okay, Devon? Yeah, great. Thank you. So I'm not normally, I suppose, talking about my work as an artist or composer. Normally I talk about other people's work. I write about music and sound art, but over the years I have created a few, small number of projects, which are all for sleeping audiences. Each of those are in collaboration with friends and collaborators. The first one, which I'll talk about, was called Eden, 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 with a close childhood friend of mine who's a filmmaker called Chloe Griffin. This was an overnight performance which had a live ensemble, and there were live film projections as well. And then there was a project which was generated by 4 sleeping performers who were wearing EEG sensors through their sleep staging. That was with Ben Knapp, Eric Lyon, and Luc Dubois. And then a sleep app which was called Long for This World, with Christopher Howarth and Julian Stein, who's from Montreal. And now I'm working on a new installation work. And in all of these, the audience sleeps overnight, but they all take different forms. And that's something that we're developing as part of this SONCITIES project that Devon kindly mentioned. So first I'm going to show just a few short clips from Eden, 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 which we did actually create a recording of in Montreal. It was Jen Reimer who did the recording. In this recording, it's myself and Eleanor Fry, the cellist, who are playing the string instruments. And the film is by Chloe Griffin. And if you do have headphones, I recommend, because it's got quite a big dynamic range and kind of pitch range. But then there's also some audio later that is very difficult to hear without headphones because it has some very low end bass tones. And what you'll hear, this is about kind of 2 hours into the piece. So there's already quite a few musicians' sounds in there. It gradually builds for about 3.5 hours, and then it's dismantling for the next 3.5 hours. I'll explain that process. But for this 1 minute clip, it's about 2 hours in, and then the next one is about kind of 2 hours after that. So the way we thought about it at the time was that this was an overnight audiovisual performance and a memory processing ritual, which was composed of continuous live sound and film projections. And what happens in the work is that an ensemble of musicians gradually assemble and then disassemble over about 3.5 hours, and then another 3.5 hours, a 13-part chord, which is a natural harmonic series that is always beating in near unison with itself. And how I would describe that, so first of all, the natural harmonic series, let's say I had a violin and I just lightly rang my finger up and down the string, you would hear the natural harmonics of that string. So we start actually on a kind of G, open G in the cello, and then she holds a unison with that G, but slowly detunes over 4 minutes, back to unison for 4 minutes, up a semitone for 4 minutes, back down to unison for 4 minutes, and all the musicians repeat that process, and they come in layers. So people kind of talked about it as almost like a wave that was kind of coming towards them for about 3.5 hours and then receding for the next 3.5 hours, and it's getting higher and higher as it goes along because the lower musicians drop out. And then the film was also a continuous production. So these were all original material that Chloe shot in different locations. And she created this kind of contraption where she was using 3 projectors and continuously inserting 5-second clips of film into 2 of them, and then using another one to create a superimposition. And the effect was one that you could see images that you started to become familiar with, but then new images are coming in, and so there's this kind of continuous pattern of familiarization and defamiliarization, and the patterns are never identical, so it's always evolving. And what we wrote at the time was that oral and visual acts become chaotically resonant through their continual repetition. Members of the audience who are invited to sleep during the performance shift between waking and dreaming states. Afterwards, their memories coincide. So this was then, we did a performance-like performance at a film house called Basso in Berlin in 2009. And I'm just going to show a short video from that performance. Okay. Here you're seeing the film projected on a screen and also reflected on a mirror. So audiences could lie back and also watch it above them or on the screen. And there are the musicians who I had to convince to play for 6 hours, basically. Very kindly obliged. Just stop there. There's a longer clip that you can find online. But what I'll say about this, it was inspired actually by a text by a French author called Pierre Guyotat, who had been a soldier in the Algerian War. His book, Eden, 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 he wrote it as a single continuous sentence. The entire novel is one sentence. It's extremely graphic, graphically violent, as well as sexually violent. And I found when I was reading it that it was almost impossible to read because the sequence of the images as well as the rhythms of Guyotat's language, I almost imagine that they were sympathetically resonating with my own subconscious, and they were constantly moving me towards an altered state of consciousness. So I basically could not stay awake and read this book. So the project was kind of a response to that work, but not necessarily reproducing, the violence of that novel, but creating this continuously resonating kind of subconscious work. And then the next project after that was a project that I did with my colleagues Ben Knapp and Eric Lyon at Queen's University Belfast, where I was working for a number of years. This beautiful poster that I love was designed by illustrator in Belfast called Stephen Graham. And it's kind of showing the two sleeping performers wearing these EEG sensors. And that's essentially, the technology we were using in the work. This was part of this. We had been playing together as a trio for a number of years. Ben, who's sitting in the middle, he is electrical engineer, and he designed, some of you might have heard of it, the BioMuse system. It's a system of sensors of kind of galvanic skin response, EEG, EOG, different kinds of biophysical signals. And he was one of the first to do this kind of sensor design at medical grade, but for outside of medical contexts. So we were using his sensors. And then Eric is a wonderful composer as well as a software programmer working in Maxim SP. He's written a book on that. So I approached them and I said, instead of doing the kind of me on violin, can we do a work together, which is with 4 sleeping performers who are basically wearing the EEG sensors and creating an 8-channel sound environment through their sleep staging. And so we worked on it for a period of about 8 months. We also tested it on ourselves, which meant sometimes sleeping overnight in the university and making sure it was kind of correct data. And so the first version was audio only, and it was coded by Ben in EyesWeb and Eric in Maxim SP. And then we also added a live generated, EEG generated light environment, which was basically colors, which was coded in Jitter by Luc Dubois, who's one of the authors of the Jitter software. And at the time I was thinking of it not so much as a musical composition as an auditory description of the states of mind for individuals, kind of similar to what Mindy and Keith were saying about thinking about music as kind of reflective of a state of being. And so those performers, all they do is they go to sleep as they naturally would, around midnight is when we start. Their brainwaves are being monitored by EEG sensors, and the audio that comes from it is this kind of continuously evolving, very dense electronic drone, like Eden. So it's kind of drone based. And something I'll say about that is that I wasn't really trying to create a piece of music to listen to. I was trying to create almost like a field of activity that you might focus your attention on, but you might also not, choose not to focus on it. And the tones evolved, their oral characteristics evolved according to how the brainwave activity evolved. So according to sleep staging, would affect the timbre of the tones, where they were in the space, their pitch, how long they were, the periodicity, the volume of the tones as well. And we go into, let's say, the mechanics of how that worked in this article called "To Be Inside Someone Else's Dream" on Music for Sleeping and Waking Minds. So if you want to kind of see the sleep mapping, I would say point you towards that. But then to talk about some of the musical aspects, again, just like in Eden, the people in the ensemble, they come in turn. And that was actually a really important thing for me. We bring them in about 10 minutes at a time, because I wanted to kind of see how does it change. So let's say I start first, I'm producing maybe 4 tones that have a certain, certain kind of oral qualities. How does that change when the second person comes in? And we could hear that it could change, did change. I was, hearing them even if I was not asleep, even if I was not awake. And also that would enable the audience to basically be able to identify orally each member of the ensemble. So each one was associated with a different combination of pitches upon entering the mix. And so that staggered entrance, that enabled listeners to kind of understand how each member was contributing to, I know it sounds a bit cheesy or wonky, but some kind of collective consciousness being described in sound. So that was heard within different states of attention while you're sleeping, while you're awakening. And it's not predictable in any way, and it's not, we're not controlling it. And it's evolving as a kind of dialogue between minds, which is both a conscious dialogue and not conscious. So I'm going to just play a quick video kind of showing this in action, and I'm going to start a little bit into it. There's no sound for the first minute or so. So the images are from two different performances. This one is actually, that's Chloe and under the blanket there. The second one where you saw people sleeping on beds was at Brunel University, and since it's a campus, can skip that one. You know, they were able to bring in beds, which made the experience much better than sleeping on the floor, as we also did in a couple of different places. So some of the things that we found, and we would every morning after doing a performance, have a discussion with everybody who was there, and we, you know, had coffee and things like that. And just to talk to people about their experiences. Well, so first of all, we were also awake over the night. We were monitoring. We would take kind of maybe 1 or 2 hour naps each, but then 2 people would always be awake. And we observed something that was for me really interesting, was that people, the ensemble, were perceptibly responding to changes in the sound environment in different stages of the sleep wakefulness cycle. So you could hear how, let's say, somebody got up and went across the room or made a sound or something like that. They were aware on some level of that, and we could hear that and how their tones changed. And I started to think of the work, and what I was kind of almost exploring was really, you know, the kind of communication or exchange between the ensemble as well as the ensemble and its environment. Another interesting thing that we found was, because we couldn't, you know, test it that many times, it was quite a, you know, difficult piece to set up technically. Sometimes there would be these sudden loud, you know, changes that we weren't expecting. And we thought, oh my gosh, everyone's going to wake up and it's going to kind of ruin the piece. And it didn't. And nobody would really wake, which was maybe strange. Although some people reported it, the sense of being continuously pulled into or out of sleep on those nights. The audience experiences really ranged. I would say some people said it was intense, some people found it restful, some people found it blissful, and some people just were completely oblivious. A lot of people said they had very vivid dreams, imagistic dreams. Some people said even though they'd been sleeping in that sound environment for many hours, they had little recollection of what it sounded like afterwards. They couldn't remember it. And then a lot of people, I guess, commented on what they felt was kind of a unique experience of kind of collective sleep, and that was what they were kind of focusing on. Of course, people were wondering things like, could we tell what they were dreaming? We could not tell what they were dreaming. The members were of the ensemble, they were always concerned with, was I a good sleeper? And, for us, there was, no distinction between good sleeper and bad sleeper. Once in a while, in their sleep, they would pull the head sensors off, and we would kind of gently put them back on. But there wasn't, anything like that. Okay, so maybe in interest of time, I'll just talk about this one other work, which was a sleep app. It's an interactive composition, and this one people would do at home, and they're creating their own music for sleeping. So basically you choose the duration, how long you want to sleep for, 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever it is, and you create your own mix for that length of time. And you can either select the sounds yourselves, or you can create a random mix. And we used many different sounds that were actually contributed by a group of friends and collaborators. So here's a kind of demo of how the software worked. It was a standalone app. Yeah.
Tie me to a dream, while the dream would me untether, and set my heart aflutter. Oh heart, that you would tie me to a dream, while the dream would me untether, and set my heart aflutter. Oh heart.
So this is just kind of showing the functionality of the app, putting in new sound files, randomizing their amplitude envelopes, making the volume go up and down, setting the volume. On the right side, you can see which sounds are being played, and then each one is associated with one of these graphic, interfaces where you can draw how present or not present you want the sound to be in the mix. So you can kind of manipulate it by pulling those lines. And then you can change the number of sounds that you're listening to at the same time. You can choose new sounds. You can randomize those envelopes.
Long for this while the dream would me untether, and set my heart aflutter. Oh heart for this world, that you would tie me to a dream. Long for this while the dream would me untether, long and set my heart aflutter. Oh heart for this world.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just show you what it looked like. We actually put them in these boxes, and you pulled the lid of the box, and there was a USB stick, and then the kind of edition notes were in the box. And yeah, so that's how we distributed that. It was a kind of, software-based piece. Right now I'm working on one more with my husband, who's Jared Gormley. And this is looking at vibrations in urban settings in cities. So the kinds of vibrations that are often very present, but maybe we're not paying attention to them, but we're absorbing them. So for example, the sounds of the subway, which in London are very loud and very difficult to escape, even if you're on a higher floor or you think you're away from the subway. So I was thinking, we're not necessarily consciously paying attention to those vibrations in our everyday lives, but how can we bring those to the kind of forefront of the subconscious through sound and music as well as visuals? So this is going to be an audio visual installation, sound and video, all recorded in and around the London Underground. So we're thinking of sub as kind of subway, subterranean, subsonic, subconscious, subliminal, submerged, and it's going to use that kind of infrasound range as well. So I'm going to just wrap by saying, these are the kinds of questions that are coming up for me in doing this kind of work. How does our perception of sound change between different states of attention? How is that shift experienced, whether physiologically or emotionally? how does our perception of sound within different states of attention affect our thoughts, our dreams, our memories? And how do we communicate those experiences? What forms do those communications take? Those are some of the questions that, are underlying the work. So I'm interested in those collective as well as individual experiences of sound and different states of alertness, and how we can create as well as respond to sound in our sleep. Are there forms of musical communication or other kinds of communication that might emerge during sleep? And also, how can you describe different kind of states of being through sound and different kinds of consciousness as described in sound during sleep? And my projects are also going a little bit into the kind of more esoteric end as well, with Eden, thinking about it almost as a ritual of processing your memory. Music as dream work, thinking about affecting people's subconscious and their memory. Maybe even how can we change how we dream as well as what we dream about through music. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Gascia. This is so exciting for me. And I'm sure everyone. Yeah, amazing. So thank you to everyone for being here and for speaking. We now have 30 minutes for discussion, and we'll try and get in as many questions as possible. If you do have a question, we're taking a speakers list again in the chat, so just add your name there, and when I call on you, you can either unmute your mic and ask, or if you want to type it, I can read the question as well. Let's try and keep it succinct. I say that to myself as well. And yeah, let's open up the floor. Okay, Elena.
Thank you guys both so much. I feel like so peaceful right now from listening to your work. I have a lot of questions. I guess one of my first questions would be, I was thinking a lot about reception when you were speaking, and we've been thinking about like what it means to encounter these very durational performances. Mendi, Keith, I was thinking of American Cipher, where it's like that typical gallery setting where it's not so comfortable to lie on the floor, versus Lull, which like I listen to like in my own bed with my cats, like it's very, very good for the body. But Gascia, when you were speaking, I was thinking about, well, what does it feel like to compose and to perform for maybe inattentive bodies? And if you're thinking about this question of reception and the encounter with your work, I kind of wondered if you could speak a little bit more to what that's been like in producing these works for sleepers.
Thank you so much for the question, Elena. Something, when you're saying kind of inattentive bodies, I was very conscious about, people are very vulnerable when they're asleep in front of you, and, to kind of try to create a kind of space or atmosphere where, people felt kind of comfortable in that. So let's say for music and sleeping and waking minds, we don't just jump into it. There's a kind of process of, talking, relaxing, and then, people go to sleep, and we're kind of watching, and so because you realize like there is this interesting dynamic whereby you are communicating with someone, but they can't necessarily communicate back with you. And so there's kind of a responsibility, in that, to do something that's not going to be damaging, or you see what I mean? So yeah, there was an awareness of that. In terms of performing live as with the musicians in Eden, that was a different kind of, space. It was in a film house. There was a bar. People were, celebratory. There was, I'm sure, a bit of drug taking and drinking, and, it was this kind of more like ritualistic kind of space that they were also kind of participating in, the audience. There was two people who said to us afterwards, we've become a couple after meeting at, your thing. So, Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if I'm quite answering your question kind of for the inattentive bodies, but yeah, it's just something we're aware of, that this communication is kind of going more in one direction, and how are people kind of absorbing what we're transmitting, and to try to do that in a kind of I guess sensitive way.
Thank you. Yeah, Josh, you have a couple questions?
Yes, hi there. Thanks. These are great talks. Really, really exciting, really interesting. Just had a question for Keith and Mendi and for Gascia around the voice and kind of and introducing texts and the voice into pieces that otherwise are kind of very atmospheric or ambient. And how do you handle the voice in terms of what, like, immediately it creates a kind of a center, it creates maybe a kind of a narrative, and activates different modes of listening than a more kind of spacious, ambient, and kind of sleepy listening. So I just was interested in some of the pieces were very kind of drone based, very atmospheric, and then some of the pieces had very particular texts written for them or spoken and sung. So just some thoughts about how you think about what the voice contributes to these kind of ambient, kind of sleep soundscape pieces.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting because, as Keith said, we've been researching hypnotic scripts, and there are ways that not just voices, but actually narratives can induce sleep rather than keep, rather than try to hold attention for the waking mind. When we started becoming familiar with them, we realized this is part of what we do anyway. Like we already have a practice that's already kind of going in that direction. But thinking about it for the longer piece of lull, and also each part of lull is doing something slightly different with the language, we did have to, in certain pieces, edit for maybe a lack of drama or something. Like, I think that, one of the things that I was trying to do with some of the pieces that were reimaginings of myths or folk tales is really focus on atmospheric description rather than plot. So there are pieces that were more about repetition, and then we were thinking about rhythm that can induce sleep. But in other pieces that might appear to be really just narrative, what I did, what I tried to bring in was really like describing a scene in such detail that would allow you to actually quiet the mind rather than awaken it. Although I feel like maybe Alana said, I was trying to hold on so I could hear the whole thing, So there were moments where I think, you just couldn't necessarily do that. But the way it was built was in order to focus on a different part of language and narrative building.
Yeah. I loved listening to lull, the kind of space between the text as well, because you're listening to the text and I suppose kind of having images, but then the way the sound is enveloping that, is also kind of inflecting how you're experiencing the text, which is, for me, yeah, just a really beautiful gesture. Yeah. And in terms of my, I guess, approach to the sound of the voice, or the voice in that one that I played, the clip Long for This World, it's funny because I didn't show it, but there was a whole thing that you could do, which was just a psychoacoustic phenomenon called phantom words by Diana Deutsch. I don't know if you've encountered this, but what it is almost like a compound word that you hear in very rapid succession in a stereo field, and it creates this kind of, again, hypnotic, as Mindy was saying, like this hypnotic sensibility. Maybe I can just share my screen again and just show you what I mean by that. yeah, here's a video showing some of the phantom words that you could just do these in Long for This World. And the video here is again by Chloe. Yeah. So sorry, that's just one one of them, but you can kind of see how, you know, if you were listening to that for a while, you start what you think you're hearing is changing, and you start kind of hearing lots of different words, and somehow they might reflect your state of mind at the time, like what you're hearing. Sometimes the same thing, you know, can sound like an angry word. Sometimes it can sound kind of, you know, different emotionally. So yeah, I guess I was interested a little bit in kind of, you know, how text like that can also be used to hypnotize. And then in terms of, you know, there were poems as well in Long for This World and text like that, you know, for me, I suppose, you know, again, kind of creating a kind of place for the listener. I don't know about if any of you do this listening to podcasts as you're falling asleep. I don't know if you do this, Josh, but I started developing maybe a bad habit of doing that. And, you know, which was an enjoyable, almost like I would say guilty pleasure, because I was like, oh my gosh, I can also like listen to stuff as I'm sleeping. But then, you know, sometimes you're listening to really intense, you know, things about the news or what's happening. And so, you know, that's, I'm quite conscious of kind of how that can affect you or affect one. But I also realized it has this weird other effect where then if you're listening to people just talk, maybe it makes you kind of sleepy because you're used to listening to podcasts every night as you're falling asleep. So I guess it's a medium that, you know, could be used in so many different ways.
Yeah, I would say just another thing about how we thought about the voice in lull is that, you know, we also thought about textural changes over time, right? And so we played around a lot. We did a lot of experimentation to figure out what kind of subtle changes in the texture of the voice we wanted to introduce at different moments, and that might be, you know, changes done with the voice, or changes done by how the voice was EQ'd, or how the voice was mic'd, and so in general we thought about making those kind of changes in what we thought of as the sort of intervals of sleep. So, you know, so most of the changes that occur in the piece happen in sort of 20 to 25 minute cycles, and then, you know, 40 to 80 minute cycles. And so, yeah, so the voice is there, but then we pull the voice out at what we think are key moments. And a lot of what Mindy was talking about, the sort of through line in the piece is sort of creating detailed context and allowing the listener to create narrative, which is, you know, what's happening, you know, when we're dreaming, we're sort of creating our own narrative with the sort of details of our surroundings being given to us. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Gascia, just for the record, my thesis that I'm working on right now is about sleep podcasts, so I would love to talk to you more about that. Guilty pleasure. I think about it a lot. Are there any other questions? I might take the time to just ask a couple while I have the floor. Gascia, with Eden, that first clip that you played, you could really hear that sort of compositional tool of the unison note or chord slowly going out of unison, and the kind of beating and the dissonance that happens there. which I find so beautiful, and it sounded amazing. Though I associate that kind of dissonance not with sleep music, not with the kind of ambient music that you imagine falling asleep to, just because it can be jarring, like it's less often found in popular music and that sort of thing. So I'm just curious about what the role of dissonance and discord is in your work, like as it relates to sleep. Like, does it help and hinder sleep, and how?
That's a really, really nice question. Yeah, in a funny way, I think, thinking back on it in terms of having something which is continuously going in and out of tune. So we actually had a little system whereby all the musicians could see this countdown from 12 minutes to 0. So they always knew where they were in the cycle, kind of whether they should be in tune or slowly going to unison, one semitone down or back up to unison. And so sometimes the chord would come back into some kind of very harmonious, non-dissonant, let's say, sound. And sometimes would become quite disturbing, as you're saying, like through those dissonances, it could become kind of so, thick and kind of beating. I think something that was, now thinking back on it, and of course it should have been obvious to me at the time, but I had just not long before that, maybe a few years before that, participated in the performance of Trio for Strings by Lamont, which was this work that he composed, I want to say, in 1958, and it's these very sustained tones. The whole piece, which is about an hour or so, and I think there's just recently been a release of this with Charles Curtis, the cellist, who was also the cellist in our performance, who was kind of directing this performance. And the way we tuned it was using this kind of, just intonation tuning. And so you're holding, as the string player, these very long kind of continuous notes, but almost like if you slightly change the pressure of your bow on the string, or if you very slightly change kind of the position of your finger on the string, it actually, creates these patterns, beating patterns. So you're trying to constantly be aware of how it should be beating in this tuning, So when I was kind of rehearsing this piece, which we did for quite a while, and some of those rehearsals would go 8 hours, and it was like physically demanding, but I started, I guess, through that to have a different kind of sensibility around kind of tuning and, how to control that kind of tuning of beating patterns, basically, and how to hear then like that. Because usually when you're playing, let's say, Western classical music, which is the tradition I was trained in, you're trying not to play out of tune, which for string players, that means, you're eliminating the beats, basically. But this was an experience which kind of allowed me to really try to hear those patterns. What I think that does, it's difficult. I don't want to kind of say it does one thing or the other. I think it creates, again, a kind of maybe depth of field or something like that, where, when things are kind of more harmonious, you're almost in a certain kind of space. And when it becomes beating and kind of, it's like, shifting your whole perception of that. So the way you're sonically creating, a sense of space can really be affected through those harmonic, let's say, interference patterns, those beating patterns, even though you're not using that many elements. So even though it's just, 8 string players. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay. Erin, you have a question? We can't hear you. All good. Zoom troubles. So we have a question that's related to the idea of sleep that makes us more productive. And okay. Okay. So, okay. All right, sounds good. Well, then why don't I just ask another question for now while this question comes to life. And yeah, I had another question for Mendi and Keith. This is similar to what Alana was asking earlier, but I was interested in this idea of meditation as a form of engagement with musical work. And with what Alana was saying about attention, I'm curious about, with meditation as a form of engagement, like how do you sort of conceptualize what the listener is actually paying attention to while that's happening? Like you mentioned sort of deep listening practices and so on. Like, is it, I know it might be a bit of an abstract question, but like, is it that sort of musical work meant to accompany the attention towards something else, or is it an immersion within the work itself? Yeah, I'm curious about how attention relates to.
Yeah, I think it's different across projects. I mean, you know, a lot of our pieces these days are installations. And so sometimes the point of the piece is to create a different state of awareness about the space that you're in, right? So listening gives you a different sense of the space. It may make, you know, sometimes we want to make the space feel smaller or larger, depending on how we present the sound in the space. Sometimes we want people to experience a space with a sense of narrative, right? So to draw attention to the narrative of the architecture through listening. These things are, you know, are not kind of unusual experiences for musicians, but I would say in general, most people don't walk around thinking about reverberation times. And so part of what we try to do is make pieces that allow people to have those kind of experiences, to become more conscious of where they are in space or even in a historical moment. So I would say that's, and sometimes that is about focusing on the actual sound that you're listening to, and sometimes that is about using the sound to meditate on other issues.
Yeah, I'll add to that I mean, I think we come to this idea of thinking about meditation as what we're inviting people to do by thinking about what kind of engagement you can have with space through listening. But another part of that is, what is the voice going to do, you know? And so particularly when the piece is, you might say, about a historical moment or architecture that is important in a historical moment, you know, the language cannot be too sometimes it can't be too direct, you know, it can't be too prescriptive, or, you know, because what we're inviting people to do is like go into their own minds and go into their own heads. So like the language that has to go with that kind of oral journey needs to be language that doesn't interfere or interrupt other sounds, as often language will do. You know, often language, if you're listening to hip hop, for example, that's going to come to the forefront, and it doesn't need to do that in meditative works. It needs to do something else, even if it is very related to hip hop in other ways formally, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say what we have sort of going in our favor when we're working in an installation context is that in general, we think of sound and images as working differently. Right? When we see something, we think of that as fact, right? This object is what it is. I'm seeing this thing in front of me. and if there's a kind of default engagement with sound, I mean, I think sound makes us ask questions about what am I hearing? Where is that coming from? And so that can be, you know, useful in an installation context. Low, sort of in contradiction, is something that people were not hearing in an installation context, right? It was a piece that people experienced through a stream, and maybe some people even experienced it through headphones. And so, you know, when we have that kind of intimacy, I would say there's a sort of different approach there. And so, you know, we have to be, I would say, much more strategic about when we introduce things that make people ask questions about what is that sound, or where is it coming from, or, you know, what kind of space is this sound in? Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. I think we have time for one last quick question from Erin. She writes, in light of the idea that there are so many sleep apps now that are about sleep in order to increase one's capacity for productivity, what are the conscious decisions you make that distinguish your work from that, or to distance from something more neoliberal?
I mean, is that while we have this notion that a restorative sleep could enable us to imagine and then create the world we want to live in, our job is the restorative part. You know what I mean? You have to decide what you want to do. And so, you know, our thought isn't really about, I mean, we didn't say this, although we've said it other places. You know, we made the piece during the summer of 2020, and there was a lot of talk about civil unrest, and we just don't like the idea that a time of action is a time of unrest. You may need to rest, you know. And so what we thought about was, what do people need who are, you know, a lot of our work has historically been about a lot of the issues that some people were thinking about for the first time that summer. So we felt like, well, okay, now you're thinking about that. What else is there, right? Rest is what else there is. And so I don't know that we need to say, you know, the kind of activity you're going to now do is X, and that's different from a sleep app. For us, it's not really, we're not entering the space in the way that a sleep app is. And so the idea is really just how do we induce sleep and then care for that sleeping mind, you know, as opposed to do whatever when that person is asleep.
That's so lovely. I don't know if I have, you know, anything to add really to that. I think it's such a lovely idea. Yeah. In a way, I didn't even know that sleep apps were aiming for that. I thought they were just helping you try to sleep. And good to know. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. Thank you so much to our speakers. This was amazing. And for all the questions, the discussion. Before we wrap up, I believe we have a quick announcement from Elena.
Thank you, everybody. That was a really wonderful way to wrap up our first year of Sleep Salons. I'm kind of glad we ended on this particular note. I just wanted to say, I just shared in the chat a hot off the press call for papers for an issue of Intermédialité that Alex and Dana and I are gonna do around sleep and dormir. So if you're interested, take a look. There's lots of different kinds of formats that we're interested in soliciting work around. And please share with anybody that you think has something interesting to say about sleep. But thanks again to Devon, thanks to Randy and to Charlene, and to Alex and to Josh and everybody who's been involved in organizing the Sleep Salons. We really have appreciated it so much. Thanks to our audience and everybody who's shown up and asked great questions. And thanks so much to our brilliant speakers today. And have a great summer, and we'll see you probably in the fall.